أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome you all to another episode of the life of Prophet Muhammad. So we've been discussing the Expedition of Tabuk. And as we mentioned, no actual fighting occurred at Tabuk. However, one of the major benefits of that battle was that Tabuk essentially demonstrated to the Arabs that the Prophet ﷺ was both willing and capable of confronting the mighty Roman Empire. And the impact of the Battle of Tabuk, even though no fighting took place, the impact was profound. You see that, there are two events in the Seerah that led to mass conversions to Islam. The first was the conquest of Mecca, which took place in the 8th year after the Hijrah. And then secondly, the Expedition of Tabuk. These are both occasions and incidents that demonstrated the strength of Islam and the Muslims. And hence you find that after the Expedition of Tabuk in the year 9 after the Hijrah, we see a steady stream of delegations visiting Medina to pledge their allegiance to the Prophet and to embrace Islam. Now, in terms of the number of delegations that occurred in the 9th year after the Hijrah, there are some historians that say that there were 14 delegations that came to Medina in the 9th year after the Hijrah. If you look at Tarikh al-Yaqubi, he states that there were 28 delegations, but most likely that number includes the delegations that occurred before and after the 9th year after the Hijrah. And I've even seen some historians put the number at 70. But there's no doubt that in the 9th year after the Hijrah, Medina witnessed the largest number of delegations, which is why the 9th year after the Hijrah is known in the books of Seerah as Amul Wufud. It's known as the year of delegations. Now, when these delegations would arrive in Medina and they would meet the Prophet and speak to the Prophet, the main request that came from the Prophet, the main expectation that the Prophet had from these groups who were paying allegiance to him, above all, the Prophet ﷺ wanted all of these people to renounce shirk, to renounce polytheism, and abandon the worship of idols. It's very beautiful that above all things, the emphasis of the Prophet when he meets these people from different regions of the Arabian Peninsula, the underlying message is the message of Tawheed, right? Professing the oneness of God and worshipping none other than Him. Now, among the various delegations that came to Medina in the 9th year after the Hijrah, there was a Bedouin tribe. There were a number of Bedouin tribes, but one notable tribe arrived in Medina and they wanted to convert. And if you look at verse 14 of Surah Al-Hujurat, there is a reference to one of these tribes in the year of delegations. This particular tribe, they arrive in Medina, and some of the commentators of the Quran, they mention that they had embraced Islam, and because there was a famine in the region that they were coming from, they were looking for some financial support. So the Quran quotes them Surah Al-Hujurat, ayah 14. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قالت الأعراب آمنا. The Bedouin Arabs, this particular delegation, they come to you and they say, we believe, we have believed. قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He instructs the Prophet to correct the claim that they are making. Say to them, O Muhammad, you have not yet believed, but say instead that we have submitted. Why? وَلَمَّا يَدْخُلِ الْإِيمَانُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ. Because faith has not yet entered your hearts. This delegation, they come to the Prophet and they say, Ya Rasulullah, we embraced Islam and we are believers, and we did not give you any trouble. We did not fight you as the others did. So the language that they were using with the Prophet, there was an undertone of them saying to the Prophet that, listen, you owe us. We strengthened you in numbers. We converted to your faith, and we're looking for you to also provide us with some support because we're going through a famine. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not mince His words here. He says to them that, listen, you people are not mu'mineen. You have just entered the fold of Islam. You have merely surrendered to a movement that has become too powerful to combat in the battlefields. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals this ayah, highlighting that many of these groups that are coming into the fold of Islam, we cannot refer to them as devout believers yet. Inshallah, they become devout believers. But what has happened is simply a profession of the faith. قالت الأعراب آمنا قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. Don't claim to be believers, but understand that you have submitted. And there is a lot of work that has to happen after you submit. Because faith is not just a matter of professing that, there is one God and that Muhammad is His final messenger. Faith entails action. Faith entails that you change your lifestyle. You live a more God-centric life, a life of virtue that is based on these divine values. Now, one notable delegation that came to Medina in the 9th year after the Hijrah was that of the Banu Thaqif. If you recall, and of course Banu Thaqif, they arrive in Medina with a delegation of 6 people. And if you recall, brothers and sisters, this is the tribe that was defeated by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Muslims in the Battle of Hunain. And they were scattered in that battle, primarily because of the heroics and the steadfastness of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib and some of the other companions. The Banu Thaqif, after they were defeated in Hunain, they retreated back to their city of Ta'if. And the Prophet ﷺ, he laid siege, and then eventually the Prophet ﷺ, he left them. He knew that they were not in a position to really pose a real threat to the Muslims, so the Prophet left them. And just to give you a sense of how stubborn and how unwilling Banu Thaqif was to surrender, their stubbornness and unwillingness to surrender were so extreme that they even went so far as to kill their leader, right? The leader of or at least one of the prominent figureheads of Banu Thaqif was Urwa ibn Mas'ud al-Thaqafi. The Banu Thaqif, of course, the overwhelming majority of them were polytheists. Their leader, Urwa ibn Mas'ud al-Thaqafi, he converts to Islam. So because he converted to Islam, they actually killed him, right? So instead of following in the footsteps of their leader, they actually shed his blood and assassinated him because of his conversion to Islam. And this is why we have some historical reports that call this Urwa ibn Mas'ud al-Thaqafi the Yasin of his people, right? Because in Surah Yasin, we have the story of Habib al-Najjar, who was killed by his people for supporting the messengers of his time. And this man, is basically like a second Habib al-Najjar. Now, eventually, Banu Thaqif, they realized that their resistance against the Prophet is futile. All of these Bedouin tribes, and there are tribes from farther regions who are entering the fold of Islam. And with every passing day, the Muslim community is becoming stronger and stronger, and their numbers are steadily increasing. So Banu Thaqif, they find themselves in a very precarious situation. From every corner of their border, they're surrounded by Muslims. And their own leader became a Muslim, so they decide that it's time for them to also pledge their allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ. So they send this delegation, this 6-person delegation to Medina. From Ta'if, they go and they travel all the way to Medina. Now, when they arrive in Medina, of course, the Prophet received them. They were treated with respect, and the Prophet was exceedingly gracious and hospitable to them. So they sit with the Prophet and they start to, negotiate the terms of their allegiance. And it's interesting that when you read these discussions that they have with the Prophet, they actually propose abandoning shirk and embracing tawheed under 3 conditions. So they say to the Prophet that, Ya Rasulullah, we will embrace Islam, we will abandon polytheism and idol worship, we will become Muslim, but we're asking you for 3 things. You need to make some exemptions for us. The first condition that they wanted to stipulate was they wanted to be exempt from performing the daily prayers. Maybe they thought that salah 5 times a day is too burdensome. So they said to the Prophet that if you can excuse us from this daily salah, we would really appreciate that. The second request and condition that they wanted to include in their agreement to pay allegiance to the Prophet, they said that they don't want to break their idols with their own hands, because a part of them still felt that these were sacred, and even on a cultural level, they were uncomfortable with demolishing and destroying the idols with their own hands. So, when the time comes that we have to get rid of these idols and destroy them, we don't want to be the ones to do it ourselves. This was the second condition. The third condition is that they wanted to keep their chief idol, Allat. One of the main idols in Arabia was situated and housed in Ta'if. So they say to the Prophet that we want to keep the idol of Allat for 3 more years. Now the Prophet ﷺ, after listening attentively to their proposal, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, لا خير في دين لا ركوع فيه ولا سجود. The Prophet addresses the first condition that they mention. Rasulullah says, listen, there is no good in a religion without bowing and prostration. In another narration, the Prophet says, لا خير في دين لا صلاة فيه. There's no good in a religion that doesn't have prayer. You have to pray. So the Prophet refuses to honor that suggestion. And then he says, وَأَمَّا أَلَّا تَكْسِرُوا أَصْنَامَكُمْ بِأَيْدِيكُمْ فَذَلِكَ لَكُمْ. As for you not breaking your idols with your own hands, that's up to you. I can grant that. We can have someone else do that. وَأَمَّا الطَّاعَةُ لِلَّاتِ فَإِنِّي غَيْرُ مُمَتِّعُكُمْ بِهَا. But as for obedience to Allah and worship of your chief idol for 3 more years, Rasulullah says this is something that I will not grant for you. So the Prophet ﷺ, he firmly rejected the first and the third conditions. Now when it came to destroying the idols and who should destroy them, Banu Thaqif said, listen, we don't want to destroy our own idols. It's too painful for us to destroy, the religious heritage of our forefathers. So eventually the Prophet ﷺ, they capitulated to the Prophet, and the Prophet said to them that I will send Mughira ibn Shu'bah, right, who has ties to Banu Thaqif, and Abu Sufyan to destroy the idols in Ta'if. Right? So I'll send these two men who are new converts to Islam, and perhaps the Prophet ﷺ, gave them this duty because he wanted them to feel important. He wanted them to feel like they were stakeholders in this new religion, that they had a position in the Ummah. And the Prophet ﷺ wanted people to feel included. So he sends Mughira and Abu Sufyan with the task of destroying the idols that are in Ta'if. Now, when Banu Thaqif, when they were in Medina, they remained there for quite some time. And they stayed with the Banu Thaqif, they stayed with Mughira, because of their connections to him and because he was related, he was a nephew of one of the leaders of Thaqif. The Prophet ﷺ, he actually sets up tents for them in the masjid. For them, a designated area for them to stay, to observe the daily activities of Muslims. And this is very important, my dear brothers and sisters. The Prophet ﷺ, he's not looking for people just to, give him taxes, or just to, symbolically acknowledge his authority. The Prophet ﷺ wanted these people to learn Islam. So this arrangement, having Banu Thaqif observe the daily activities of Muslims in the masjid, it allowed them to learn the fundamental teachings of Islam, both in theory and in practice. So they're listening to the Prophet's sermons, but they're also seeing what Muslim life looks like in action. And this is very, very important, combining theory with practice. The Prophet wanted them to observe what it means to live as a Muslim, so they could take that experience back to their people. Now, among the 6-person delegation from Banu Thaqif, there was a young man who was among them. So one of the 6 was a man by the name of Uthman ibn Abil As al-Thaqafi. This man, this individual, Uthman, it seems that he had secretly embraced Islam, during one of his earlier visits to Medina, perhaps many years ago. But it seems that he was hiding his faith. He was in a state of taqiyya, if we want to call it that. He hid his faith. He concealed his faith. And he was quite young. But despite his youth, the Prophet ﷺ, he actually appoints him as his governor in Ta'if. He gives him an official position as the governor of Ta'if, because Ta'if is a major city. Ta'if is one of the most important cities in Arabia. And the Prophet appoints him, despite his young age, primarily because of his fervent passion for studying Islam and his profound devotion to the Quran. For the Prophet ﷺ, he wants someone who has emotional intelligence, but he also wants someone who is serious about implementing Islamic teachings in Ta'if. So this is the person that the Prophet chooses. The Prophet is looking for people who have the most knowledge when it comes to faith, aside from the administrative skills that are naturally going to be required. So the Prophet appoints this Uthman ibn Abil As. Now, before sending him back to Ta'if in this new role as governor, the Prophet ﷺ, he actually offers him a word of advice. And the advice the Prophet gives really reflects the great wisdom and the mercy of the Prophet. And it shows what an extraordinary leader he was. So Uthman ibn Abi al-As, he actually shares, and this is mentioned by Ibn Ishaq, he shares the advice that the Prophet gave to him as he was preparing to depart Medina to go back to Ta'if and basically lead his people. قال كان من آخر ما عهد إلي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله حين بعثني على ثقيف أن قال يا عثمان تجاوز في الصلاة. Uthman ibn Abi al-As, he says, among the last instructions that the Messenger of God gave to me when he sent me to govern Thaqif is that he said to me, O Uthman, be considerate in prayer. Right? Because as governor, you're also going to be the Imam of Salatul Jama'ah. You're going to be the Imam of the congregational prayer in Ta'if. So the Prophet says, be considerate of others when you lead them in prayer. وَقْدِرِ النَّاسَ بِأَضْعَفِهِمْ, and measure people by their weakest member. Right? When you lead prayer, take into consideration the situation and the circumstances of the person who's weakest among them. فَإِنَّ فِيهِمْ الْكَبِيرِ, right? There are those who are elderly among the congregation. وَالصَّغِيرِ, and there are those who are young, and there are those who are ضعيف وَذَا الْحَاجَةِ, and there are those who have, who have needs, special needs. So be considerate. Do not prolong the prayers so much so that it's a burden upon the people. Make Islam easy for people. Right? Can take into consideration the weakest members of your community. And that's precisely what he does. He goes and he implements that policy of leniency when it comes to the congregational prayer. He doesn't turn the congregational prayer into this long, drawn-out religious ritual. Now, Ibn Sa'ad, the famous scholar of history who wrote a very, very beneficial book called At-Tabaqat, he's a Sunni scholar, but he gives us biographical information on the different generations of Muslims. It's the meaning of Tabaqat. It's like a biographical book with the names of companions and second generation Muslims and so on. And he kind of gives us some biographical data on individuals from various generations, beginning at the time of the Prophet and in the generations after. He speaks about, in his book At-Tabaqat, he speaks at length about the year of delegations. And he speaks about how these delegations were honored. They were treated as honored guests by the Prophet ﷺ. And this is profound because many of these people were actually enemies of the Prophet. Many of them fought against the Prophet, or they colluded with the enemies of the Prophet. But when they came to Medina, the Prophet treated them as if they had done him no wrong. He treated them as honored guests and completely disregarded what had happened in the past. He did not hold a grudge against these people. The Prophet he's a person of a very gentle, merciful nature. He's rahmatan lil alameen after all. So when these delegations would come, Ibn Sa'ad, and this is also noted by other scholars of the seerah, other historians, they mentioned that upon their departure, so these delegations would come and they would spend many days and maybe even weeks in Medina speaking to the Prophet and interacting with other Muslims. When they would prepare to leave, upon their departure, the Prophet ﷺ, he would bestow upon them generous gifts. He would give them gold, silver, he would give them dates, and even land. He would actually parcel out land, and he would give land to the tribal leaders. And the deeds of land ownership would remain within their families for generations. Now, why was the Prophet doing this? The Prophet ﷺ, of course, everything that he does is filled with wisdom. And everything that the Prophet does, the ultimate goal is to bring people towards the truth, to make them better servants of God. So the Prophet's actions, when it came to honoring these delegations and giving them gifts, and in some cases lavish gifts and land, the Prophet wanted to build strong alliances and foster goodwill among the tribes. He didn't want these people to be half-heartedly devoted to Islam and the Islamic State. So by hosting the delegations and giving them these valuable gifts, the Prophet ﷺ, on one level, he was showing them the hospitality and the respect that Islam dictates. And he wanted to strengthen the bond between the Muslim community and these newly converted tribes. He wanted them to feel that they were truly a part of this family, this religious family. And by granting land to tribal leaders, the Prophet ﷺ was able to ensure long-term loyalty and stability. These leaders, now that they have land that was given to them by the Prophet, they had a vested interest now in maintaining a good relationship with the Prophet and the Muslim state. And you can imagine that with the passing of generations, the children and the grandchildren that inherit this land, they will have a very positive image of the Prophet in their minds. In fact, they will attribute their economic flourishing and their financial well-being to the generosity of the Prophet. And this will make Islam attractive to them, that Islam didn't only take us out of darkness into light, but Islam also improved our economic situation. So this was a way to keep the hearts grounded and connected to the Islamic State. Now it's interesting that it's also mentioned that some delegations would bring their sons, they would bring their children, and they requested that the Prophet ﷺ place his blessed hand on their heads and make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showers them with his grace and his mercy. And the Prophet's gesture, and of course the Prophet did this with people, and this was seen as a profound act of compassion and care. And it deeply affected these people when they saw how much love and concern that the Prophet had for their children. And by blessing their children and making dua for their children, the Prophet ﷺ, on one level, he was honoring their requests. He did not decline any of these requests. And he reinforced the sense of community, especially among these new converts. And he asserted himself as the spiritual father of the Muslims, right? That they're not giving bay'ah to a dictator. No, they're giving bay'ah to the Messenger of God, who is a father figure for all Muslims, who has more love and compassion and concern for the Muslims, more than even a biological father would have for his children. So this act of placing his hands on the heads of the children who were a part of these delegations, the Prophet did this to strengthen the bond between himself and his followers, and to really foster this sense of unity. We also see that the Prophet ﷺ, he offered tribes guarantees of amnesty, right? Because many of them, as I mentioned, they had fought against the Muslims. They had colluded with their enemies. So the Prophet ﷺ, sometimes even without the tribes asking for it, the Prophet reassured them that now that you have come into the fold of Islam, we will protect you. You're now one of us. And we will protect you from hostile Muslims and non-Muslims. So the Prophet's offer of amnesty, this was a strategic gesture aimed at securing peaceful relationships and alliances with various tribes. One of the most important things in an Islamic state is stability and security. The Prophet ﷺ did not want any of these newcomers to feel that they might be in danger now that they have joined, now that they have joined Islam. The Prophet wanted to mitigate any sense of danger. He wanted to mitigate the potential conflicts and really create an atmosphere of security and safety among these neighboring tribes, because this is the foundation of any prosperous society, that people have to feel safe. One of the worst things for a nation is for the people to feel in danger, to feel that their borders are not safe, to feel that their blood might be shed, that they might be invaded. The Prophet wanted to make it clear to everyone that they are safe and they are under the care and the protection of his government. Now, another thing that we see the Prophet do with these delegations is that before the departure of each delegation, the Prophet ﷺ, he would assign a teacher to instruct them in the Quran and the principles of Islamic living. So the Prophet ﷺ, either he would appoint someone from among them if there was someone who was learned in that delegation. If not, the Prophet would send them. He would send them a teacher. And this was important because this exemplified Rasulullah's commitment to spreading knowledge and understanding of Islam beyond the confines of Medina. Right? He wanted the Muslims to develop intellectually and spiritually. So the dissemination of Islamic teachings was a primary objective of the Prophet in his interactions with these delegations. Another very interesting thing that we see during this year, during the year of Amul Wufud, is that you have some people who are coming to Medina. Some of these delegations included individuals who had been burdened with derogatory names. At birth or maybe in their communities, they were assigned vulgar names, names that were shameful and demeaning. For example, in one of the delegations, there was a man by the name of Ghawi ibn Abd al-Uzza. Right? So Ghawi means someone who has gone astray, someone who is misguided. So his name is literally Ghawi, the misguided one, the deviant, the son of Abd al-Uzza, the son of the servant of al-Uzza, which is one of the main idols. So the Prophet changes his name. He changes the name of Ghawi ibn Abd al-Uzza to Rashid. The opposite of Ghawi is Rashid, the one who's rightly guided. So he calls him Rashid ibn Abd Rabbah. Rashid, the son of the servant of his Lord. He gives him this beautiful name. There was another man, he came to the Prophet, and his name was Zayd al-Khayl. Right? His last name, al-Khayl, it means horse. So his name is literally Zayd the horse. And of course, this is denigrating. This is a demeaning name. It's a derogatory way of referring to a person, to call them a horse. So the Prophet changes his last name, right, to al-Khayr. He became known as Zayd al-Khayr. And al-Khayr means the good. Zayd the good. So the Prophet ﷺ, this habit that he had of renaming individuals who carried stigmatizing names was a demonstration of his compassion and understanding of human dignity. The Prophet ﷺ, he understood the power of names. By giving them honorable names, the Prophet wanted to uplift their spirits and erase past associations and instill in them a sense of pride and honor. And this, of course, is a reflection of the hikmah, the great wisdom of the Prophet, in recognizing the importance of names in shaping identity and self-perception. The Prophet ﷺ, even when it came to people's names, he wanted people to feel valued and he wanted them to be respected in the community. And this is a message that is echoed in the Quran in many verses, and one example is in Surah Al-Hujurat, Surah 49, verse 11, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, la yaskhar qawmun min qawm. O you who believe, let not a people ridicule another people. Don't ridicule each other. Asa an yakunu khayran minhum. Perhaps the people who you are ridiculing, perhaps they are better than you. وَلَا نِسَاءٌ مِّن نِسَاءٍ. And this command is not just for men. Women should also not ridicule one another, especially believing women. عَسَىٰ أَن يَكُنَّ خَيْرًا مِّنْهُنْ. Perhaps those the women who you are ridiculing, maybe they're better than you. وَلَا تَلْمِزُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ. And do not insult one another. وَلَا تَنَابَزُوا بِالْأَلْقَابِ. And do not call each other using offensive names. This reminds me of a story during the time of the Prophet, where one of the Prophet's wives, Safiya, who had Jewish ancestry, she used to be ridiculed and made fun of by some of the other wives. They would call her, the daughter of the Jew. Right? In their minds, this was, a way of putting her down. So she came to the Prophet. Safiya comes to the Prophet, his wife. She says, Ya Rasulullah, so-and-so, they're making fun of me. They're making me feel like an outsider. They're saying to me, oh Safiya, you're the daughter of a Jew. And the Prophet ﷺ, he tells her that if they say that to you again, tell them that my forefather is a prophet, because she comes from the line of Harun. And my great uncle is also a prophet, and he's Musa. And I am married to a prophet. So tell them, don't make fun of me. Don't try to put me down, because Allah has honored me by making me connected to 3 prophets. And this shows you, brothers and sisters, that the Prophet ﷺ would always intervene when he felt that people were being denigrated and disrespected. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he cares about people's emotional well-being. He cares about not just, when he sees physical harm, even emotional harm. The Prophet had zero tolerance for name-calling and putting people down. There's another interesting incident in the year of delegations where there was a Ju'fi delegation from Ju'fa. They came to Medina, and the Prophet, he offered them a roasted heart to eat. A roasted heart. Now, this delegation, in their culture, in their pre-Islamic culture, it was forbidden for them to eat an organ of an animal like the heart. But the Prophet ﷺ, why does he offer something to them, knowing that in their pre-Islamic culture, they deem it to be forbidden? It seems that by offering them the roasted heart, something that they traditionally consider to be forbidden, Rasulullah ﷺ perhaps wanted to gauge their response and their willingness to adhere to the teachings of Islam over their tribal traditions. And the Prophet ﷺ, being a teacher and a guide, he wanted to instill in his followers that they should always prioritize Islamic principles over cultural practices. Right? So Islam says it's halal to eat roasted heart. Your culture says it's haram. So what is it? Are you going to go by what your Jahili culture was teaching you, or are you going to align your dietary restrictions based on the law of God? And perhaps we can even say that the Prophet offering them a roasted heart was a reminder that Islam is vehemently against imposing unnecessary and baseless restrictions on oneself. Islam encourages us to adhere to practices that are rooted in faith and reason. And Islam discourages the imposition of arbitrary restrictions that serve no purpose other than cultural or traditional norms. So the Prophet ﷺ, he wants, these new converts to make a distinction, to discern between what is truly prohibited and what is something that is perceived to be, what is perceived as prohibited because of cultural influences. Now, another interesting incident that takes place in the year of delegations is that you have two individuals, Abu Amr ibn Sayfi and Wahshi. Right? So Abu Amr, he was a self-proclaimed spiritual leader in Yathrib prior to the arrival of Rasulullah in Medina, when he went on the Hijrah. And when the Prophet arrived in Medina, similar to Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Abi Salul, this Abu Amr individual, he despised the Prophet. He felt as if he was losing his influence in Medina because of the presence of the Prophet, and he had a lot of contempt and resentment against the Prophet, so much so that he would often wish for the Prophet to be exiled and isolated. So he was a staunch enemy of the Prophet. Now, after the conquest of Mecca, he flees. Where does he go? He goes to one of the only remaining stronghold of shirk, which was Ta'if. And of course, many of you know Wahshi, who is infamously known for his role in the assassination of Hamza in the Battle of Uhud. He also, Wahshi and Abu Amr, these two individuals who were basically enemies of the Prophet and enemies of Islam, after the conquest of Mecca, they both seek refuge in Ta'if. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the people of Ta'if, Banu Thaqif, they embrace Islam. They forge an alliance with the Prophet. So now these two men, they find themselves with no sanctuary. They're no longer safe. So Abu Amr, being the stubborn, wicked person that he was, he refuses to yield. He doesn't want to even face the Prophet. He doesn't want to pay allegiance to the Prophet. He was so arrogant that he decides to embark on a journey to Syria, and he ends up dying in solitude. Subhanallah. His dua used to be that he wants the Prophet to die in solitude, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showed him who is the one who's deserving of that demise. So what he prayed for against the Prophet actually came back and was actualized in his own life. Now with Wahshi, unlike Abu Amr, he decides to go to Medina. And he figures that the Prophet is merciful. He's pardoned many people. He's granted amnesty to some of his most bitter enemies. Maybe he'll also forgive me. So Wahshi, he goes to Medina to meet the Prophet, to essentially embrace Islam, to pay allegiance to the Prophet. Now, as soon as Wahshi enters Medina, of course, the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, everyone knows Wahshi. Wahshi assassinated one of the greatest individuals in the Prophet's community. The killer of Hamza. He was known as the killer of Hamza. He was notorious. So when he steps foot in Medina, of course, everyone is giving him dirty looks. They're disgusted even at the sight of Wahshi. But the Prophet ﷺ, when he sees his companions getting agitated, he tells them that, listen, we should all extend mercy. He asked all of them to forgive and to cool down, and that they should extend mercy to his uncle's assassin. Now, after Wahshi embraced Islam in front of the Prophet ﷺ, of course, before the conversation took place, the first thing that the Prophet said when he greeted the Prophet, he said to him, "Awahshi? Are you Wahshi?" And Wahshi, he says to the Prophet, "Yes, it's me." The Prophet ﷺ, and this shows you how hurt he was over the murder and the mutilation of his uncle. He said to Wahshi, "Akhbirni kayfa qatalta ammi." I want you to tell me, how did you kill my uncle? فأخبره. So Wahshi, he told him, and he went into detail about what he did. Because Wahshi felt that this was sort of a confession. So he confesses everything and he explains exactly what he did to the uncle of the Prophet. The narration says, فَبَكَى. The Prophet began to cry as he recalled and he remembered that body, the body of his beloved uncle. وَقَالَ غَيِّبْ وَجْهَكَ عَنِّي. Imagine the Prophet, a mercy to the worlds. Yet he says to Wahshi that, "I forgive you, I accept your conversion to Islam, but do me a favor. Hide your face away from me. I don't want to see your face. Because every time I see your face, I remember what you did to my uncle. So you're forgiven, your Islam is accepted, but just don't show your face to me." And Wahshi, not only was he the killer of Hamza, but later on in the following year, in the 10th year after the Hijrah, before the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he actually kills Musaylama, right, the false prophet. And this is why Wahshi famously would say, "قتلت خير الناس وشر الناس." He said, "I have killed the best and the worst of people. I killed Hamza, who was the best of people. And I also killed Musaylama, who was the worst of people, who was a false prophet." So with that said, brothers and sisters, that was just a little bit on the various delegations that entered Medina in the 9th year after the Hijrah. Inshallah, in our next episode, we're going to do a deep dive into probably one of the most important delegations, which is the delegation of the Christians of Najran and their famous encounter with the Prophet and his Ahlul Bayt. Inshallah, we'll discuss that in detail in our next episode. Thank you so much, brothers and sisters, once again for tuning in. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Thank you for the lecture, Sheikh. And there's a question. Isn't it a contradiction that the Quran states that belief must be due to free will, but instead some tribes adopted Islam by force because of their fear and defeat?
So the ayah that I think that you're referring to is the verse "La ikraha fi din." Is that the ayah that you're referring to?
I assume so. This is an online
So
question.
there's a misconception about that verse, because when it comes to faith, people often say that you can't force people. You have to because there's no compulsion in religion. Now, there's a discussion among the ulama about this verse. The majority of the scholars that I've read, they say that this verse is to be read as a descriptive verse, not as a prescriptive verse. What does that mean? So it's not that Allah is saying, don't compel people to become Muslim, because there are certain situations where if you're dealing with non-Ahlul Kitab, you give them a choice. Either you embrace Islam or we go to war. This is This is something that is agreed upon by all Muslims. It's only Ahlul Kitab who are given the option of Islam or jizya. But jizya is not offered to mushrikeen and kuffar, unless, of course, the Prophet decides, to have a treaty with them. So the verse is descriptive. Allah is simply highlighting the reality of faith, that faith is not something that can be forced, meaning that you can't put a gun to someone's head and say, believe that there's only one God. Yes, they can say it to save themselves, but deep down, the heart is only going to submit to something that it actually believes in. Now, the Prophet ﷺ is going to try to incentivize people to embrace Islam. Now, in the beginning, it might not be sincere, but the hope is that as they learn more about the faith, as they interact with Muslims, that superficial faith that might have been motivated by worldly interests will eventually evolve into a sort of genuine faith. So there's nothing wrong with using tactics to bring people into the fold of Islam. So there's no problem with that. That verse, La ikraha fi din, is descriptive. It's just describing that's just the reality of the heart. The heart is not going to accept things by force.
This kind of sounds like a tactic for raising children as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a very good way of thinking of it. Sometimes when we want our kids to start praying, for example, they probably do it begrudgingly, and maybe you have to, offer them some type of reward if they pray on time for, an entire week or an entire month. So yes, it's true that maybe they're praying on time because, they simply want the gift, and they're not doing it, purely, to seek nearness to God. But the hope is that, you're trying to incentivize them to do what is right in hopes that it will be done out of conviction rather than a desire for some sort of reward. And we see this, I mean, this is ultimately why we have a portion of zakat, which is to be dedicated to al-mu'allifatu qulubuhum, right? Those whose hearts are inclined to Islam. There's a reason why the Prophet, after conquering Mecca, he gives, herds of camels and sheep to Abu Sufyan and the Umayyads. He wants to soften their hearts to Islam. Right? The Prophet, of course, the Prophet knows that many of these people are probably not embracing it out of conviction. They're embracing it because there are worldly advantages. But you have to start somewhere. So hopefully, after they gain these worldly advantages, maybe Allah will soften their hearts to the truth.